Good morning. It's Wednesday, May 20th, 2020. My name is Karl Soltero. I am here with my colleague on the La Raza Historical Society, Dr. Ramon Martinez, to interview Mr. Hilbert Morales. Mr. Morales is a scientist, a newspaper publisher, a philanthropist. In short, he is a Renaissance man who has a fantastic story to tell, and we are here to interview him and to let the world know about his life story.
Okay. My name is Hilbert Morales. I was born on February 4th, 1929 in Gary, Indiana. My parents are from Torreon, Coahuila. They migrated in 1910 with my sister Rose and elder brothers Seville and Andrew, and crossed into the United States from Ciudad Juarez into El Paso. At that time, my dad was a railroad worker with the Southern Pacific Line, and which I learned one day when I flew him to Palo Alto, and we were coming down 101, and he said, "See that line there? I worked on it." And the line was the railroad line, and I never knew that he was a railroad worker until then.
They came over, they had 3 kids.
When my dad and mother, who brought 3 kids with them, my oldest sister Seville, or Rose, and my 2 brothers, Andrew and Seville, they crossed from Ciudad Juarez into El Paso. At that time, my dad was a Southern Pacific Railroad worker. The family lived in a boxcar that traveled up and down the line wherever they were working.
Great.
Eventually, my dad heard that there was work at the Carnegie, Illinois Steelworks in Gary, Indiana, which was built in 1910 to 1918. And they came at 1910 to Gary, Indiana, where they settled. And the rest of the Morales family children were born in Gary, Indiana. I was number 5, born on February 4th, 1929, in Gary, Indiana. One of the reasons he decided to migrate was because as an indigent, he never really had a permanent job, nor was he considered for a good job. And the indigents were being deprived of their land, which they had occupied forever without title. And so when people came from elsewhere and claimed the land as theirs because they have the government papers saying they had the title to the land, there was, of course, a confrontation, and which led to a revolution of sorts. And he was advised when he was in the field, working in the cornfield, by a lady said, "They're looking for you in the city. We think you should just start walking north." So he started walking north and left my mother and the kids back in Torreon. But later he sent for them. My dad earned a living as a railroad worker for SP, and the family lived in a boxcar which went from Texas, El Paso, all the way up to Burlingame on that SP line that he worked on. He heard about the steel mill that needed laborers in Gary, Indiana, and decided to go there. So when the labor force on the railroad labor force got down to Oklahoma, he basically left that group, traveled up to Gary, and began being a steel worker at the Carnegie, Illinois Steelworks, which later became part of USS Steel. What I recollect as a childhood memory is living in a white clapboard house which stood on stilts on 19th and Cleveland in Gary, Indiana, and there was a sand dune behind it, and we used to climb as kids up that sand dune when you got to the top, there was a cemetery, and that's the cemetery is still there. But recently, I visited, and the house is gone. So that's what I remember about where I lived. Now, my first recollection is that a family from Alabama moved up and lived across the street, and their kid came over and hit me on the head with a shovel because I was Mexican. And for years I had a scar here that has over time went away. It had a keloid from where I got hit, but the keloid is gone. But I remember that quite vividly. My uncle Valentine, my dad, both worked in U.S. Steel Gary Works and blast furnace number 4. What I recall is that during World War II, my dad was promoted to supervising blast furnace number 4. But when the war ended and the white labor force came back, he was relegated back to the labor force in the labor force pool, even though he had the technology and the knowledge, and in fact had run blast furnace number 4 for 4 years. The second home I recall was at 1513 Jefferson Street, which was about 2 blocks from Frable School of Gary Unified School District, which is where I went to elementary school after being expelled from St. Emerick's Catholic School because I used to get into fights with all the white guys and who would call me a dirty Mexican, and I have scars on my knuckles that helped convince them otherwise. In any case, I graduated from Gary High School, Frable High School, in June 1946, and went through 3 years of military service immediately thereafter, because in 46 the veterans were coming back from Europe and the Pacific, and I knew that a 16 going on 17-year-old would not get a job. So I volunteered for 3 years of military service, which turned out to be a very good thing. The second house that I recall, after living on the Cleveland house near the cemetery, was at 1513 Jefferson Street, which was in the Central District of Gary, Indiana, which was a Mexican district peppered with African Americans and Spaniards. My recollection as a kid was going to dances at the Sociedad Mutualista Mexico organization that my dad was part of until he got dissatisfied with the leadership and just never went back to that organization again. But that organization would hold Friday and Saturday dances, which was the social event of the Mexican community of the Central District at that in the late 30s, before World War II started. What I recall was my brother Seville was very good as a car repair person, and Andrew was someone who was a person who tried to get into a small business. They were drafted, and I recall my mother crying a lot when they both left for the military in 1942, when I was 13 years old. At St. Emerick's Catholic Elementary School, I was was the cause of a lot of fights. So instead of the others being expelled, I was the one who was transferred to Frabel Elementary School, which was a mixed school of Anglos and Hispanics and blacks. Its closest rival was Roosevelt High School of Gary School District, which was all black. What I recall is that there was what we would today call blatant racism in the Central District, and it was the district where gambling houses existed, card game houses existed, houses of prostitution, and such. And the police made themselves scared unless there was a fight or a shooting. To survive the Central District of Gary, Indiana, you had to become very alert at all times, because basically you never knew what was going to happen, and what you didn't want to do is to get involved. So that's what I recall. Now, one of my teachers, Lenore Smith, one day took me aside and said, "Hilbert, one of the reasons you get into trouble is because you're super bright. You do in 15, 20 minutes what it takes other kids 55 minutes to do. So I'm going to give you these extra books to read when you have done the assignments." So, hello. Excuse me, I gotta do something. My dad had a 6th grade education level. My mother graduated from elementary school, 8th grade. That was their level of education. However, they were both had minds full of common sense and logic. My mother was a devout Catholic, and she made sure that all of us attended a parochial school in the beginning, and later ended up in public schools. My parents never hit me or any other brother or sister. Their voice, their tone of voice, their level of disappointment, their conveyance of high performance, a concept of commitment to excellence, was communicated verbally. My dad, both my dad and mother were very intelligent and full of common sense. I never realized how smart I was until I took the Army Group classification test and scored 189 or 90. And I remember this major asking me if I took the test, and I said, "Of course I did." "And did you cheat?" And I said, "How can you cheat when you're in a cubicle with a piece of plywood in front of you and a piece of plywood on either side of you, and you're in this space all alone?" I said, "Of course I took that all by myself. Is there a problem?" And Major Brumby said, "Yes, you're off the chart, and you're a Mexican." So I thought maybe you cheated. I said, "No, I said, being Mexican has nothing to do with it. You were asking questions about math and physics and other stuff." He said, "Well, you scored so high that you're a natural candidate for officers candidate training, But if we put you in that category, you need to agree to at least 8 years of service. And I said, no, I want to do 3 years of service because I want to get my GI Bill, and 4 nines are 36. There's 9 months to an academic year. I figured 4 nines would allow me to get my first degree and move on. So I just want 3 years of service and move on. I do not want to become a professional military person. Besides, what bunch of troops would follow this mad Mexican charging up a hill? They'd probably shoot me in the back. Well, my mother and father were Roman Catholics. My dad never went to church that I recall, except for weddings, because he was always working. The pride of his existence was a Ford pickup truck that he used to pick up used railroad ties, and I was the one who would chop those up, and in wintertime they became the firewood that kept the house so warm. My mom cooked for, I recall that to make ends meet, she rented out a room to temporary workers who moved in from Mexico, and they would stay with us for about 2 or 3 months until they got the lay of the land and settled. It was, we were never really that poor, but we were impoverished. I recall one Christmas when what I remember is the smile on my mother's face when her face went from being very worried to a smile when the local group brought in about 4 boxes of packaged foodstuff for Christmas and Thanksgiving. And much later, when I was an adult, I realized that the reason she was so worried is that there was basically the cupboard was bare in the household until those boxes came in. Then we had a great feast based on that. But my older siblings, starting with Sister Rose, I recall that she studied very diligently with stenography because she wanted to become a court stenographer, and she practiced that at home. My brother Seville was very good at auto mechanics, and in fact basically ran a repair shop at a curbside, because I remember one incident where a trucker came in and there was something wrong with his engine, even though the engine, it had a certain ping, and Seville listened to the motor, told him to stop the motor, and he took off a certain spark plug and reached in there with a magnet and pulled out a little bitty nut that was pounding around inside the cylinder, and put everything back, and when he was through, there was no ping noise, and so he wanted $150 for his service, and the trucker bitched about it. He said, all you did was remove a plug. And I remember very distinctly Seville saying, yes, but I know which plug to move, and I knew what the problem was. And if you had gone anywhere else, they would have disassembled your motor, finding that little bitty nut. So what you were dealing with was knowledge, my insights, my sensitivity to how that internal combustion motor works, and it was worth $150. And if you don't want to pay it, I'll put the nut back. My sister Socorro was of average intelligence and was not that motivated to learn anything. She's the one that basically ended up marrying and having kids. My sister Rose was really bright. She's the one that became the stenographer. The baby of the family was my sister Teresa, who was also very bright. I don't know much about her because by then I had left the family and I was in Japan in the medical corps. And when I got out of the army, I immediately went to college. I was never home when Teresa grew up. She eventually died at an early age of a brain tumor. That's what I remember about my sisters. But Robert became a gifted painter who was highly valued by the Gary's Advertising Corporation, which did. He created these big billboard signs that you see on highways, the ones that are 50 feet long and 12 feet high. His sadness in life was that he won a scholarship to an art school after high school, and he had submitted a design that he did with a soft graphite pencil. It was a vegetation, but it was done in such a way that you could actually see green when there was no green on that paper. It was all design. But then he couldn't go because there wasn't enough money in the family to let him go to this art school. So he was hired by Gary Advertising, and he became one of their valuable sign painters. And in fact, he helped organize the Sign Painters Union of North America and became a labor organizer who, as I learned later, went to Washington, D.C. and during the time when unions were being debated by Congress back in the 40s and 50s. My brother Mike was very interested in metallurgy and all the processes that go on in a steel mill. And he was very belligerent with his attitudes, and he ended up working in steel mills like my dad his whole career. I, on the other hand, wanted to be a doctor, but I never got into medical school, so I decided to become a biomedical research person, which led to my career.